2007 and re-elected at every election since then. He represents the Cork South Central constituency, which is, of course, a rather crowded constituency when it comes to members of government right now. A chartered accountant by profession, his experience is surely standing to him with this portfolio in these challenging times. Minister, thank you again for participating, and I'm going to hand over the floor or the screen to you, and you can take as long as you need. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ivan, and good morning to everyone. Hope you're all well, and thank you all for giving us some of your time this morning, and hopefully everyone will enjoy the engagement and get some value out of it. So I do want to just start by thanking you, Ivan and Shana and the staff and the board of TASC for the invitation to join you and to have this discussion. And you told me earlier on that this is the 20th anniversary as such this year now of TASC. So I just want to commend and congratulate you and all of your colleagues for the work that you're doing on an ongoing basis and for the contribution that you're making to public discourse, to public policy formulation. I think your contribution has been really significant, and that's why I'm delighted to have the opportunity today of having this chat with you. So today, as part of that conversation, I wish to talk to you about a couple of important new initiatives that my department is developing, and I'm sure the Q&A will extend well beyond this, which is absolutely fine. But what I want to touch on in particular is the whole area of equality budgeting and well-being budgeting, and I know those are initiatives that are close to your heart in TASC. While these new initiatives are at different stages of development, at their heart is a concern with ensuring that all of our society progresses and that public policy and public money makes an important and effective contribution to supporting that progress. However, before going into both initiatives briefly, I will just begin by placing them in a broader context of my department's ongoing work to enhance how resources are prioritised and how public policy is designed and implemented. And I do hope that today's discussion will be one of open engagement, and I do look forward to hearing your thoughts on what has been done to date in response to the pandemic and how these initiatives might be developed over the next number of years. Over the past 12 months, of course, two critical issues have dominated the policy landscape. The first is the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on society and indeed on the economy as well, and the consequences this has had for public expenditure in Ireland. The second, of course, is Brexit, where our focus was on trying to mitigate the risks of a no trade deal Brexit, and is now on deepening our relationship with post-Brexit UK and fostering North-South relations. And we're all well aware of the challenges in that regard that we've encountered in recent weeks, unfortunately. But before the pandemic, there were significant challenges, and these have not disappeared. They may not be dominating the news headlines, but they are still there and they need to be addressed. And in the Programme for Government, our Shared Future, the government has set out these challenges in terms of missions. So, for instance, universal healthcare, including the implementation of Sláinte Care, a new social contract in the areas of social protection, pensions, family carers and disability, a new Green Deal, such as those relating to emissions, retrofitting and a just transition, housing for all with the aim of tackling homelessness and delivering affordable home ownership, and finally building stronger and safer communities. And as part of Budget 2021, which we introduced last October, an amount of almost €88 billion was provided for 2021 to fund key public services and to allow the state to provide continued support to mitigate against the impacts of COVID on our society and on our economy. And first and foremost, almost 76 billion of that 88 billion in funding has been allocated to core expenditure programs to ensure we continue to deliver incremental improvements and put in place the building blocks for the delivery of meaningful improvements in key priority areas. So that 76 billion has nothing to do with COVID. The remaining 12 billion or so is in the context of COVID and recovery, and I'll touch on that in a moment. So core current expenditure will grow by 3.8 billion euro this year, or just over 6% compared to the allocation in 2020. And this increase is primarily driven by an increase of almost 1.9 billion or 10.7% in health, and seeks to address capacity issues to enable our health service to better meet the needs of our citizens during the pandemic and beyond. We have made that a decisive step now towards implementing Sláintecare, improving the permanent capacity of our public health system. And I think the need for that has been underlined in very stark terms in recent months. Similarly, substantial investment is being made to support state infrastructure projects, which my department has direct responsibility for. So this year, total expenditure on core capital programs is to increase by around 1.6 billion, or nearly 20%, bringing core capital investment to over 9.7 billion. And when you add into that the carry forward from last year of underspends and additional COVID-related capital, the overall budget for public capital investment in 2021 is almost 11 billion euro. And as set out in the programme for government, a review of the National Development Plan is now underway. This review will allow the government to take account of the COVID crisis, reflect priorities in the programme for government, strengthen the alignment with the National Planning Framework, and the link with the latest climate action plan and other sectoral policies. Outside of the core expenditure commitments, there are a number of supports relating to the COVID-19 response that are reflected in the departmental estimates or budgets set out in the revised estimates volume for 2021. These costs amount to about 6.5 billion and include 3.2 billion in social protection payments and 1.9 billion to support the health service in response to COVID. But as you are all well aware, good public policy is about a lot more than simply allocating money. It is very important that public policy is designed and implemented with a firm focus on ensuring that limited public resources, and they will always be limited, are used efficiently to deliver effective public services to our people. And when this department was established a decade ago, it embarked on a process of reforming the budgetary framework. Prior to these reforms, the budgetary process emphasised the allocation of money. While such a focus was and remains important in relation to controlling and monitoring expenditure, it was too narrow in that it told the public little about whether or not the public resources were being used to achieve worthwhile results. In addition to the establishment of the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service, which has contributed to increasing the capacity of the civil service to undertake evidence-informed policy work, I would like to just touch on 4 specific initiatives that have been taken to enhance the budgetary framework. Firstly, the Performance Budgeting Initiative has sought to broaden the scope of expenditure policy from one that was primarily concerned with financial resources to include a focus on the public services that are provided and the impact that these services are having on people's lives, because ultimately that's what really matters. And every December, performance information for each department is set out in the revised estimates volume. And more recently, my department has begun to publish an annual public service performance report that outlines key outputs that have been delivered each year. Second, we have the spending review process, which critically assesses key policies and expenditure programs in supporting of the service-wide agenda of evidence-informed policy making. Over 100 papers have been published since 2017, and these represent a very significant effort to use evidence to inform and support policy formulation and development. You know, when we do spend money, I think it's important we have a process of looking back to see if that money was well spent and if we achieve the outcomes that we set out in allocating the money in the first place. I think that's really important. Thirdly, this public spending code sets out the rules and procedures that ensure that the best possible value for money is obtained whenever public money is spent or invested. And finally, we have a whole of year budgetary process now. This has been progressed over a number of years. While the pandemic has impacted on some of these processes, in a normal year, the publication of the summer economic statements and the mid-year expenditure reports outlines the mid-year economic and expenditure positions. We have the National Economic Dialogue, which brings together a broad range of stakeholders with the purpose of fostering a discussion on how to use the limited available resources to address the many competing economic and social priorities we face as a country. And of course, there is ongoing engagement with the Oireachtas, especially through the various sectoral committees as well as the Budget Oversight Committee. So in fact, earlier this week, I and Minister Donoghue met with members of the Budgetary Oversight Committee to discuss the interim report that they published on parliamentary engagement throughout the budget cycle. And I think we will make more progress in that regard over the lifetime of this government. Something that goes unremarked, but it is worth highlighting how these various initiatives have contributed to greater openness and transparency in Irish public life. Whether through the publication of performance information or analytical papers or public-facing engagement with stakeholders, there is now an unprecedented volume of information on public policy available, and this is a really welcome development. Having set the overall context, I'd now like to just outline for you the work my department is undertaking in the areas of equality and well-being. Over the last decade or so, there has been an increasing focus on the issue of well-being. This has been particularly evident in the work of the OECD, as well as different countries, most notably New Zealand, who have developed well-being frameworks. And what has driven this change of focus has been an acknowledgement that economic growth, while important in generating the resources we need to provide key public services, is too limited a measure of how society and people are faring overall. It is more a means to an end rather than an end in itself, and that is very much my own personal political philosophy. The programme for government includes a commitment to developing a set of wellbeing indices to create a rounded and more holistic view of how our society is doing. It's intended that these wellbeing indicators will be used to highlight inequalities and ensure that policies are driven by a desire to do better for people. In addition, it's intended that the wellbeing framework will be utilised in a systematic way across government policy making, in setting budgetary priorities, evaluating programmes, and also reporting progress. One of the challenges with developing a wellbeing perspective for public policy is that few, if any, would disagree with the idea that public policy should seek to enhance wellbeing. However, the question arises as to what this means in practice. One way of bringing a bit more focus to the idea of wellbeing in a policy context is to think about wellbeing in terms of SENS, capabilities of persons to lead the kind of lives they value and they have reason to value. This capabilities approach, I think, focuses attention on ends, what it is a person can be and what they achieve. From a public policy perspective, this focus on the ends is important for a number of reasons. It describes people's lives and the challenges they face. From a policy making perspective, this supports efforts to define the policy challenge and to set clear policy goals. It acknowledges that the context within which the policy intervention is to be implemented is complex. It focuses attention on the broad range of interacting factors that need to be taken into account when trying to design and implement public policy to address complex policy challenges. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, it presents public policy as a way of creating opportunities for people to change or progress their lives in the way that they see fit. For instance, the provision of education and training provides people with the opportunity to develop their knowledge and skills that over the course of their lives can shape their employment prospects, their health, and their overall well-being. When educational opportunity may be at risk of being denied by poverty or deprivation, public policy can intervene in a more targeted manner to try and alleviate the impact of educational disadvantage. A well-being perspective, by focusing on the ends, does not deny the importance of the means or public resources, but it does shift attention from a question of simply providing resources to address a policy challenge to being clear about what the challenge is and how public policy can create opportunities for people. In terms of bringing some concrete reality to these concepts in an Irish context, the Department of Taoiseach is leading a process now, co-sponsored by my own department and the Department of Finance, that will develop a wellbeing framework for Ireland. Rather than looking to reinvent the wheel, this process will begin by building on existing work. Both the OECD and New Zealand have outlined multi-dimensional frameworks. These frameworks seek to capture the diversity of people's living conditions by focusing on both objective and subjective aspects of their current lives. For example, income and wealth, housing, health, work and job quality, civic engagement, and social connections. Such frameworks seek to capture distributional aspects of well-being in order to examine if everyone or only some end up better off. Finally, these frameworks also provide an opportunity to examine the sustainability of well-being. By considering the resources and risks that impact on future well-being, these frameworks pose questions about how policy decisions that promote well-being today may have a negative impact on well-being in the longer term. While the development of high-level well-being frameworks is important in terms of developing a shared understanding of what makes for better lives and influencing public debate on strategic priorities, such frameworks do not in themselves fulfill the ambition of improving policy design and decision making. There is a need to go beyond presenting high-level indicators, and my department will be seeking to develop an increased understanding of well-being as a policy objective and examine how best to integrate it into the various stages of the policy making cycle that we have presently. An important aspect of developing a wellbeing framework is to look beyond national averages to examine how various groups of people differ from each other. The Equality Budgeting Initiative was first introduced as part of Budget 2018. Since then, it has progressed from an initial focus on gender to now include socio-economic inequality and disability. By drawing on the approach set out by the Performance Budgeting Initiative, the Equality Budgeting Initiative seeks to enhance budgetary processes and policy proofing by focusing attention on questions of advancing equality, reducing poverty, and strengthening economic and social rights. In particular, these questions seek to bring to the fore evidence about the likely impact of budgetary options and decisions, facilitating the integration of equality concerns into the budget process and highlighting the risk of unintended consequences. In 2019, a structured framework was introduced based upon advice from the Equality Budgeting Expert Advisory Group to capture the various dimensions of equality in a more holistic manner and to reflect various government-wide strategies in place, including ensuring gender equality in relation to advancing socio-economic equality and women in leadership, combating sexual and gender-based violence, and promoting equality of opportunity for parental care, ensuring people with disabilities have equal opportunities, and promoting integration and ensuring a fair and inclusive society for minority groups, providing accessible health and wellbeing services, and providing early intervention through children and youth services as well, delivering equality of access to education and to housing, and supporting those in lower socioeconomic groups and providing better access to opportunities. Work in this area has also been supported by the OECD's 2019 report, Scan of Equality Budgeting in Ireland, which was commissioned by the Department of Public Expenditure, my own department, and the Department of Justice. The OECD's report sets out a path for developing equality budgeting in Ireland. Work is underway now on implementing these recommendations, most notably the identification of national and international goals to focus equality budgeting on the areas of most need. And finally, last October, my own department published an equality data audit that was undertaken by the CSO. So by way of conclusion, Ivan, I hope that this has been a useful overview of some of the new initiatives that my department is currently involved in progressing. These are very important cross-government initiatives. And when people think about value for money, there may be a tendency to emphasize the money element of that phrase. And while it is very important to be focused on what we do with our limited resources, I hope you will all agree that this department is also very interested and focused on what the citizens of Ireland and the people of Ireland generally get for that money, what impact the services provided have on people's lives. The two initiatives I've touched on today are very much concerned with developing ways of ensuring public policy is designed and implemented in a way that ensures the best outcome for everyone who lives in our country. But this isn't simply a matter for my department. If our concern with enhancing well-being and promoting equality is to be progressed in a meaningful way, then it also requires active engagement and dialogue with and between a broad range of stakeholders. And it's for this reason I'm very interested in your responses to what I have outlined today, in particular your thoughts on how these initiatives might be further developed over the next few years. And I'm sure that our Q&A will extend into a much broader set of issues. So thank you for your attention, everyone. And Ivan, thank you for facilitating my opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Minister. And thank you for such a wide-ranging set of remarks. One quick question. We have a number of questions here on fiscal policy, and I'll try and condense it down. But in terms of the equality budgeting, are there any plans to put it on statutory footing?
Not at this point in time. I think we want it to become embedded in the budgetary process on an all year round basis. So when I look at all of the key documents that we produce now in the annual budgetary cycle, we are making progress in embedding equality metrics in those. So for example, in the revised estimates volume, which is the Bible as such that sets out the public expenditure framework for the entire year, that now has a keen focus on equality budgeting. And I think we just need to check that when we are making decisions, we need to equality proof them, and that for me is the focus. And it has to be a cross-government approach, that while all spending decisions ultimately come through this department, we need buy-in from all of government, and that's why on the wellbeing front, for example, I think it's so important that the initiative is led by the Department of the Taoiseach, and on Tuesday of this week, just 2 days ago, the Taoiseach brought a memo to government setting out our approach to developing that wellbeing framework, and I think that is very much complementary to the approach we're adopting in relation to equality budgeting too.
And do you think we need a public sector reform that actually leads to a larger public sector?
Our public sector is growing, and I think that coming out of the pandemic, we are going to have a larger state. We're certainly going to have a larger public service. For example, in the whole health area, we have given sanction and funding for the recruitment of about 16,000 extra people in our health service across 2021. So our public service is growing and will rise to between 360, 370,000 people over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. Because I think learning the lessons from COVID means that we will need to have a larger state in key areas of public service, particularly in health. And while people talk about the extra €4 billion that's going into health in 2021, that is not by any means all COVID related. Of course, some of it, about half of it, relates to making sure that our public health service has the resources it needs to deal with the pandemic. But we have also made the step change decision to increase the capacity of our public health system, critical care capacity, acute bed capacity in our hospital system, investing in primary and continuing and community care. So an extra €2 billion in 1 year to go towards those measures is a very significant change in direction. I think it's one that we needed to do as a country anyway, but COVID-19 has just underlined and really underscored the imperative of doing that. So we are going to have a larger state, and I'm sure you'll be coming on to the question of how we're going to pay for that, because ultimately all of these public policy decisions have to be funded either through revenues that we collect as a state or through borrowing. And we have to ensure as a country that our public finances are sustainable. So that is the challenge that we have, as over hopefully the months ahead, we come through the worst of this pandemic and we plan ahead for more normal times. We will have a new national economic plan that will be focused on economic, but also critically social recovery. And I think that is so important for our country as we seek to maximise the benefit from European funds. The European Recovery and Resilience Facility, for example, Ireland will get about 850 million in grants from that source, from the Brexit Adjustment Reserve Fund as well, over €1 billion. And we will need to ensure, and I've no doubt you will come to this critical issue of how we are going to pay for it and how we can ensure our public finances are sustainable. And in April of this year, we will set out a medium-term framework as part of the Stability Programme update that will lay out a roadmap for the repair of the public finances over time. But it is our genuine view and it is our policy focus that bringing about economic recovery will do the vast bulk of the heavy lifting. And that is the focus of this government. We have a COVID adjusted unemployment rate now of the order of 25%. The state is now directly supporting the incomes of over 1 million people in the form of the wage subsidy scheme, the pandemic unemployment payment, and the other income supports. that have been introduced in the context of COVID. The direct costs are running at about 1.3 billion per month. But we did make provision in the budget, thankfully, I think, and prudently, for contingencies, for a recovery fund, and we're now going to be using those funds, and we will need those funds in the months ahead as we try to get through what I think is the worst phase of all of this, and properly resource the vaccination programme, and over time, ease the restrictions so that we can open up our society and our economy, but that will be done in a very gradual and responsible way, because lessons have been learned from the experience of recent months.
Well, thank you. And I think that leads nicely to the next question in terms of the government is set to run a fiscal deficit of around 10%, I think, give or take. And of course, the burden of servicing that debt is now set to fall. So assuming that there's no pressure from the EU, will the government continue to implement fiscal consolidation even if debt servicing remains low? And if so, in what criteria would you propose reducing spending or increasing taxes? Is that to reduce debt or reduce the deficit or some other benchmark?
Okay, so that's a really good question, Ivan. And just to be clear, we certainly haven't introduced any fiscal consolidation to date, and nor are there any plans to do so. If you look at 2020, for example, the previous government and then the incoming government, which came into office at the end of June, ended up spending about 15 billion euro more than was originally planned for 2020 in a pre-COVID environment, and that was done because it had to be done in health, in income supports, business supports, and so on. And we've made really strong provision this year in the budget to continue with those supports, and we have the various contingency and recovery funds and more funding coming from Europe as well. So in relation to the medium-term outlook, because I think that really is what that question cuts to the chase on, there will be a requirement over time for Ireland to, in the first instance, eliminate its current budget deficit and borrow for capital purposes. And I think that's the first milestone that you move to over a period of time. As you know, some of the fiscal rules at the European level have been set aside through the General Escape Clause for now, and so we do have the flexibility to run higher budget deficits, and we will need that flexibility for a period of time. So while as a percentage of GNI star, it is true to say that our deficit is of the order of approaching 10% in GDP terms. For 2020, the estimate at this stage is that it stands at around 5.5%, with a general government deficit of about 19 billion euro. There's a huge amount of uncertainty and volatility in relation to the picture for 2021. Back in October, we predicted that 2021 would see a budget deficit of the order of 21 billion euro. We made certain assumptions at that time. Some have proven to be quite conservative, and others have proven to be less conservative. We assumed that there would not be a trade deal on Brexit, and there has been, so that's a positive. We assumed that there wouldn't be a widespread vaccination programme, and there is, that's a positive. But equally, we assumed that there wouldn't be a prolonged period of stringent lockdowns, and there has proven to be such, so that's a negative. We did assume that there would be some restrictions on a rolling basis, perhaps regional, over the course of the year. So the extent of the costs being incurred and the period that they will have to be incurred over is certainly deeper and longer than we would have anticipated back in October, and that would put the various funds under strain. What we've committed to in the programme for government is to borrowing to fund the deficit, to over time move to reduce the deficit, ultimately move to a broadly balanced budget. That is the ultimate destination. But our focus in achieving that is to bring about economic recovery. We are pursuing counter-cyclical policies. And I think it makes sense that when the economy is weak, the government should step up and do more. And that is exactly what we're doing in the current environment. If the question is, can I say that we will never have to make a difficult decision over the lifetime of this government? Of course, I can't say that. It would be dishonest and disingenuous to say that. We are setting up a commission on taxation and welfare. That will set out in the coming months a range of options for government under various taxation headings. If we look at the current taxation code, if we look at tax expenditures, which I know TASC and other think tanks have an interest in examining as well, to see are we really getting value for money for different tax expenditures. But the overall focus will be on bringing about recovery. That will require investment. That's why we're bringing the public capital investment programme to a new all-time record high as a country. And whatever measures we have to implement over the next number of years, that will be our guiding focus, and we will seek to ensure that bringing about recovery is precisely what we need to achieve, because that's what will do the heavy lifting. Though of course it is possible that government will have to make other decisions, but nothing in the short term, nothing I envisage in the next while, because the absolute focus is on helping people to get back to work. To impose cuts now or in the near future would be counterproductive and would make a difficult situation even worse.
Do you have thoughts on spending reductions versus tax increases, or is that too open at the moment?
Yeah, our thinking is not in that space, to be honest, Ivan. You know, we're not thinking about what fiscal consolidation looks like or how it might work in the future. You know, when you have 480,000 people on the pandemic unemployment payment, and about 115,000 of them, and it's worth emphasizing this point, lost their job last March immediately on the first lockdown, and they haven't worked since. And, you know, businesses that, you know, on an underlying basis were healthy going into the COVID-19 pandemic deserve to be supported and to be given every fighting chance of coming through this period. So our focus genuinely is on trying to get people back to work once we come through the worst of the health pandemic. And, you know, that has to be the singular focus of government. That's why we're investing, you know, huge sums of money in education, in training, in reskilling, in apprenticeships. There will be a new Pathways to Work programme introduced by the government. And so we want to give businesses that are there the capacity to come back. That's why we've invested so much in restart grants. We have a new business aid scheme. We've committed to continuing with the wage subsidy scheme beyond the end of March, for example. We have the scheme there for businesses that are closed to help them meet some of their fixed costs. We have tax warehousing provisions of €2 billion of tax has been parked. We are prepared to guarantee 80% of the loans that banks give to businesses to help them with the cash flow and liquidity challenges that they're facing. So sincerely, the focus of government is on, you know, helping the country to get through this period and bringing about economic recovery. And in the medium term, we will deal with the challenges that arise in the future.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned the EU Stability and Growth Pact and parts of it that has been suspended. Will the government consider arguing for a reformed pact before the suspension is lifted, particularly the need for sustainability, climate action, and things that have added to the mix since that pact was put in place?
Yeah, thanks, Ivan. And, you know, we're in a fortunate position to have the president of the Eurogroup as a member of government. So he is very well qualified and very well placed to provide some leadership on that issue. And I know that Minister Donoghue is giving very careful thought to what the unwinding of the easing of current rules might look like for different countries, because lessons will have been learned. One of the issues that I felt wasn't properly reflected in the fiscal rules was the way in which we account for capital expenditure. You know, I think that investing in capital expenditure in the public capital programme makes great sense. We can borrow at historic low rates of interest, but the way in which it's accounted for currently and the way in which it's reflected in the fiscal rules is not very accommodative. And I think that there is definitely scope there for it to be accounted for in a manner that is more supportive of countries investing in public capital programs, because there has never been a better time to invest in the infrastructure that we need, whether it be digitalization, hard infrastructure, research and development, climate action measures, renewable energy, and so on. And so that's something I'm really committed to, because we're now going through the review of the National Development Plan at this time, and we'll be setting out our public capital investment program and framework for the next decade. So I certainly want to make sure that that is properly accommodated within the European fiscal rules. And so I think that additional flexibility in that area is particularly welcome, and much of that money will be spent on greening the economy, on tackling the climate emergency. And so we will need that flexibility, and I know that is an issue Minister Donoghue is taking a personal interest in.
A few other quick questions, and then there's a few topics I want to move on to. When, or do you know when you'll start to withdraw the pandemic supports? And will that affect the support we'll receive from the EU based on the fact that our economy grew last year by comparison to some of the other EU member states?
So we are committed to continuing with the supports for as long as they are needed and as long as we can afford them. And they are costly, but we can afford them for now. And what we have committed to is that there won't be any cliff edge. We're not going to overnight bring about the ending of schemes like the wage subsidy scheme. An abrupt end to any of these schemes would add to the economic challenges and damage that we're currently facing. So the removal of these schemes, which will happen over time, and it will happen, they're not all going to be a permanent feature of our taxation and our spending programs, will happen on a gradual basis. We'll have to manage it very carefully and very responsibly, because there will be a consequence when you start to remove certain supports. And that is something that we are currently considering in the context of the European support. I think what that question may be getting at is the policy of the ECB, their monetary policy, and the extraordinary interventions in the market that they are continuing to implement. They have committed, as you know, at this point in time, to continuing with the bond buying program, the exceptional measures, until March of 2022. But of course, they will keep that under constant review. And as everybody knows, one of the key benchmarks that the ECB is always looking to is Eurozone inflation. And, you know, there are different views in different countries, and there have been, you know, legal challenges in respect of their mandate and what they have been doing. But we are satisfied that the ECB will remain supportive for now. They will continue with these policies for the foreseeable future. But there will come a time, Ivan, and I think it is a point that we have to be honest about. There will come a time when the ECB's intervention in the market will be withdrawn. And then at that point in time, investors and the bond markets, whether we like it or not, it's a fact of life, will form a view as to the debt sustainability of each country's public finances, how they're managing those finances, what their economic prospects are, and so forth. And one anchor that Minister Donoghue and I firmly agree on, and that we're working towards, is that Ireland would, you know, remain firmly within the pack. In other words, that we wouldn't be an outlier on the negative side, that we wouldn't stand out as being a country that has a much higher deficit than all of our peers. Because if we were to do so, then when the ECB does withdraw its support from the market, that attracts unwarranted attention in Ireland, which would have direct impacts on the interest rate that we have to pay for our debt. As you know, the NTMA is doing a great job in taking maximum advantage of the exceptionally benign borrowing conditions that are there at this point in time. So even though our stock of debt is rising from about 200 billion at the start of last year to closer to 240 billion at the end of this year, the cost of servicing our debt is falling and the average interest rate is falling. So we are availing of the low interest costs, and the NTMA is availing of you know, longer maturity profiles, so that in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we're not facing a major refinancing cliff, and so we're not exposed to the markets in that sense. So we're trying to take maximum advantage, but there will come that point when the ECB's interventions will be withdrawn, and then the markets will take a view of Ireland, and we know what can happen if they take a negative view.
Thanks. And where will housing or increased investment in housing be on your priority list post-pandemic? And you mentioned Sláintecare in the Sláintecare report. Is this something the government does plan to implement, this universal single-tier healthcare system, given the amount of investment that has been put in healthcare because of the pandemic?
Yeah, and listen, those were the two top priority areas in the election that we had a year ago. It was all about housing and health, and then within weeks it all became about COVID out of necessity. But I absolutely believe that once we come through COVID, and we will recover, housing will again come centre stage. It is very much up there as it is, and there's a very sharp focus across government on making progress in housing, and we are making progress, but I think it will become again most likely the #1 priority issue. We are committed to addressing the housing crisis. We are investing huge sums of money now, quite rightly, in directly building public housing. So we have funding provided of over €3 billion to the Department of Housing for housing measures in 2021. They will provide 12,750 new social homes. About 9,500 of those are direct build public houses. Now, the pandemic and the shutdown of construction will have an impact on that. I have to be honest and acknowledge that those numbers will come under pressure, but the funding has been provided to deliver on that, and Minister O'Brien is introducing a range of affordability measures. So our focus is on building public housing on public land, introducing a range of affordability measures. We want our councils, our local authorities and our AHBs to directly build housing, and we're giving them the funding to do so. We did it when Ireland was a much poorer country many decades ago, and we will do it again, and that is a priority for us. We have the Land Development Agency, which will have really as its primary focus making maximum use of public land to deliver public housing. And the legislation for that has now been published, as well as the affordable housing legislation as well. So I'll be taking a very direct interest in this area and working with Minister O'Brien. And we also need to try and address the private market, because we need more homes built that are affordable. So government can't do it all. We can do a lot with a help to buy scheme and various interventions and shared equity scheme. But in the overall sense, we need to make homes more affordable, and we need to deal with some of the blockages and the issues that are there in the system that are currently preventing that. In relation to healthcare, the government is committed to implementing Sláintecare. I mean, the full implementation of Sláintecare will take many years, but we know what needs to be done. It is essentially about universal access to public healthcare, to healthcare in this country. For me, the key issue that has stood out from the time I came into government a short number of months ago was the issue of capacity. We have to address the capacity issue. COVID has underlined the need to do that, and that's why when I was negotiating the budget with the Minister for Health for 2021, I was very keen to nail down what exactly are we getting for the money. And that's why we got hard numbers about the number of extra beds in critical care in the acute hospital system. There will be a new Sláintecare public-only consultant contract. The legislation that enables that comes from my own department and will come into the Oireachtas in the next number of weeks. That is a decisive shift as well in the way in which consultants will work within our public hospital system. All new contracts will be public only in terms of the work that they do. We will of course always have a parallel private healthcare system, and Sláintecare is not about shutting that down, and there will always be people who will want to go that route for their care, and that is not the focus of Sláintecare, but it is about fixing the public healthcare system and ensuring that there is equal access for everyone to public healthcare, and that's what we're determined to make progress on, Ivan.
Thanks, Minister. Could you speak to the current situation of vulture funds buying up distressed mortgage portfolios in Ireland? In January we saw a large portfolio of AIB being bought up. Now, they say that in 2018, you were quoted as describing the Ulster Bank as outsourcing its dirty work to the US, to a US vulture fund. Do you still hold that view, or what can the government do to actively protect or support Irish households who face mortgage arrears?
This was a keen area of focus for me in opposition, and I made real progress even from opposition in addressing this issue. For example, in the last term of government, in the early part of the last term of government, we had a scenario where the loan owners, the so-called vulture funds, were not regulated, and even for a time, the credit servicing firms, the agents in the middle, were not regulated either. So the previous government introduced regulation for the credit servicing agents, with whom all of the customer contact was. I was of the view that the final decisions in respect of these loans were made by those sitting on top, the funds that actually owned the loans. And so from opposition, I introduced private members legislation to ensure that the loan owners, all of these funds, were directly regulated by the central bank. And after a lot of work, the government accepted that bill, even though it came from opposition, and it was enacted. And so it now means that all of the loan owners in this country are directly regulated by the central bank, who can inspect them, who can knock on their door, who can investigate them, and who can take enforcement action against them. So for me, that was a really important reform, which was brought about. But to answer the other part of your question, I think it is far better if banks work through loans themselves with customers. They should be dealing with customers in respect of their own individual circumstances. They are and have been under pressure from the single supervisory authority within the ECB to reduce their non-performing loan levels, and they had done a lot of good work in that space to reduce them, and now those levels will inevitably rise again in the context of COVID. I have strongly supported the work of people like David Hall, the iCare Housing Initiative, for example, to facilitate the ethical purchasing of loans that are in deep distress so that people can stay in their home. And for me, the government needs to fully back the mortgage to rent proposals so that people who are in a completely unsustainable situation, and there are some, that they should be allowed to stay in their home on a mortgage to rent basis. And I think that offers real potential and will go a very long way to resolving those issues.
Thanks. You mentioned government-backed loans to business. And there's a question as to why the government is allowing the banks to charge SMEs up to 4% interest on these loans when the government can or is borrowing money at less than 0%.
Yeah, so we have, as has been acknowledged, introduced a whole range of liquidity measures. Some of them have worked well. For example, the Microfinance Ireland loan schemes, very strong demand for them, significant take-up. But I would acknowledge that the credit guarantee scheme, we provided an envelope of €2 billion for that. The uptake has not been what we would have liked. I think that's for a combination of reasons. I think the appetite to take on additional debt at this time is understandably limited. And then we do get a lot of anecdotal feedback from businesses as well in relation to their interactions with the banks. What we have done is we have extended the range of platforms through which these loan products can now be made available. So non-bank lenders, for example, have now been equipped and empowered to participate in those schemes. And we're looking to go further through the SBCI and include credit unions in relation to the rollout of those schemes as well. The government doesn't set the interest rate, and there are costs that banks have to meet in setting the overall interest rate that is charged. But the interest rates are better than what the market would otherwise set in the absence of government intervention. So I think the government intervention has gone a long way to de-risk those portfolio of loans. And there is a coupon or a premium that has to be paid because of a government guarantee, and the European rules around that as well. But banks have to take into account not just the cost of funds, but the cost of capital and other costs as well in arriving at the figure that they ultimately charge. So government doesn't set the rate, but the rates are lower because of the government intervention. but we do want to see, in particular, the credit guarantee scheme have a greater impact, and we are examining the reasons why the uptake has been limited. Is it demand? Is it supply? Is it the cost and the price? We are examining those reasons to see what can be done.
Thanks. Keeping an eye on the time here, so just a few brief questions I wanted to touch on as well. Is the government giving any thought to the impact of Brexit and pandemic on small businesses, and how there's been long-standing challenges there with capacity and relatively low value added when compared to other EU economies? And I'll tag on to that additional investment in research and higher education. With the UK leaving the EU, there may be opportunities for Ireland in that respect.
Sure. Well, first of all, on Brexit, the big thing was avoiding a no trade deal, and that took years of work. And I acknowledge the work of the previous government, and then the new government, and of course the work of the European Commission and Michel Barnier and his team. But it is a thin trade deal. It is not the same as the UK remaining within the single market and the customs union, and we need to acknowledge that there is a difference, a significant difference. And many of the businesses who've contacted myself and colleagues in recent weeks, have made very clear the difficulties that they are encountering in respect of rules of origin, for example, which are quite complex, and I think were probably not fully understood until they materialized in the post-Brexit environment, and also at the consumer level then in relation to tax and VAT, in relation to the motor sector, the importation of cars from the UK and so on. So there are lots of different strands to Brexit, all of which are still only revealing themselves. And that's before you touch on the issue of Northern Ireland and the special arrangements that we entered into there in the context of the withdrawal agreement and the protocol. And we have seen the difficulties that have arisen, and we're really determined to try and fix those, because we want to protect the all-island economy, protect the Good Friday Agreement. We recognise the importance of having free-flowing trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland as well, of course, and so that issue is of real focus. So what we are doing through the Recovery Fund, some of that funding is in the context of Brexit, is providing funding to the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. I sanctioned funding earlier this week, for example, for the Sustaining Enterprises Fund, which is for exporting businesses, for manufacturing, for internationally traded services firms to avail of that funding. We have the Brexit Adjustment Reserve Fund that I touched on earlier on. We will get over €1 billion from that, which we will be using to support the enterprise sector to address some of the non-tariff barriers and costs that they are having to incur. And then, of course, some particular sectors like fisheries have been very badly affected, the worst affected, really. We are going to have a special package for them, and I'm working with Minister Charlie McConalogue to deal with that at this moment. And then just on the further and higher education issue, I think the fact that we set up a new government department, Ivan, is evidence of our commitment in this space. One thing that the Taoiseach has been consistently passionate about in his political life has been education. I share that passion on education with him. I think that is the pathway and gateway to a better future for so many people. So many of us have been, the first among our family to go to college and, to avail of the opportunities that are there. So we are investing now in further and higher education in a way that wasn't done in the past. And we've given them a lot of extra supports in the context of COVID, but there are funding challenges, and I'm working with Minister Simon Harris in relation to those. It's about further and higher, it's about PLCs as well as third level institutions. We have, of course, the technological universities now. We have Dublin, we have the Munster one, we have the Southeast one as well coming on stream. So a real focus from government on further and higher ed, on research, on science, on innovation. That is the future for Ireland as a small, open trading economy, being attractive to foreign direct investment, which then creates an ecosystem for a whole range of SMEs to operate and thrive within as well.
Thanks, Minister. Do you want to comment briefly on the public sector pay agreement building momentum and what your hopes are and how confident you are, given recent developments, though I know that's very early stages.
Yeah, and balloting is continuing on it, Ivan. So the aggregation of ballots by ICTU and the Public Services Committee, I believe, happens on the 23rd of February. So it is at quite an advanced stage. A number of the larger unions have advocated to their members that the deal represents a good deal and should be backed. And I think the INTO today confirmed that their members in quite a strong ballot have approved the deal. So I welcome that. ASDI yesterday, albeit on a very low turnout, rejected the deal. That wasn't unexpected, and we continue to work with them in relation to their concerns. But SIP2 and Forza, I mentioned the INTO, the INMO as well have recommended approval. So we're hopeful that it will be approved. I think many people see it as an interim deal. It is only out to the end of next year. What we sought to do as part of that deal is to ensure that the modest pay increases favour those at the lower end the most. So, for example, we have a number of 1% pay increases, but that will be a minimum of €500 for each public sector worker, even if they're only earning 20,000, 25,000. 1% will be worth €500. We have the sectoral bargaining element as well, which I think will help to address a number of the lingering legacy issues that are there. And also we are putting in place a process for dealing with Haddington road hours, reinstating overtime rates, and improving a number of other allowances which had been cut previously. So all in all, I think it's a good deal, particularly for low and middle income public servants, and I do hope it is ratified in 12 days' time.
Thanks, Minister. Well, I think it would be good to finish on a soft question. So over the years, we've seen many changes in the political landscape here in Ireland. Parties have come and gone, merged, threw out their majority rule only and coalesced with adversaries. But last year, we saw the most seismic shift in the political landscape was the decision for Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil to enter coalition together. So can you, having been involved in the negotiations, can you mention a few of the things that have pleasantly surprised you about this new arrangement? But given that it's not all good, can you give us a few of the challenges that arise that weren't expected or otherwise?
I thought you said this was an easy question.
This is my question, Minister. At the end, I get to ask.
The last one is always a hard one, isn't it? Look, I think it's working well. I mean, we're in government since the end of June. It has been non-stop. I mean, it is very intense. You know, I was an opposition spokesperson for about 9 years, and so had a lot of experience and, you know, built up a lot of knowledge and understanding of the issues. And you need all of that to prepare you for the challenge that faces you coming into government at a time of a global pandemic. I mean, look, I've been really impressed by the quality of the public servants, the people who work with me in my own department. Absolutely first class. You know, any information I want, any report I want, any help I want in trying to make a decision, absolutely first class. And the colleagues are working well across government. Party leaders meet every Monday night and have a chat before Cabinet on Tuesday. I think that works very well. That's a way of you know, trying to smooth over any contentious issues and trying to reach agreement at leader level. I'm on all of the Cabinet committees, which is a great experience, and that's where you can get into the detail of issues. I really enjoy that, the policy work and getting into detail on all of those. Second part of your question was what's not working so well, is it?
Yeah, well, or challenges that you hadn't anticipated.
Look, I think I think leaks are the one thing that anyone in government would like to stamp out. We see the weekly parliamentary party meetings of not all parties, but certainly my own party, Fine Gael party. They might as well be live streamed at this stage, Ivan. They're so leaky, and I find that frustrating because, you know, you might make a contribution, set out the context, you might speak for a few minutes, but then one line gets leaked and it's, you know, the context isn't presented, and that can be frustrating. So I think leaks, I think, you know, are damaging. I think we should have our debates in an open and transparent way insofar as we can, but there will be times when there need to be private, hard discussions, and you should have the confidence to be able to do them and speak your mind without fearing that it might be on Twitter 5 minutes later.
Minister, thank you so much, both on my own behalf. It's been a pleasure to moderate this discussion, but thank you also on behalf of the staff and board of TASC. We hope that we will have other opportunities to have these discussions. And before we sign off, you mentioned, Minister, TASC is celebrating its 20 years anniversary, and part of these discussions are part of that, but they will continue. On March 2nd, Catherine Murphy will join the discussions. There's a lunchtime seminar with the author Peadar Kirby on March 19th, and then there are a number of others running into March and April, including Claire Daly, Rose Conway-Walsh, and Mary Lou MacDonald. So on that note, I think we will finish. Again, Minister, thank you for the time, and thank you for being so open in your presentation and also in your questioning. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivan. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.